Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melie, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. Today's guest is Parfait Bassalé, a belonging strategist, conflict resolution practitioner, singer-songwriter, and the author of the book The Way of Befriending, Transforming Relationships and Organizations for Belonging. In a world where division, loneliness, and distrust seem to be pulling us farther apart, Parfait offers a different way forward, choosing courage, curiosity, and compassion as we move toward people whose experiences, beliefs, or backgrounds might differ from our own. Drawing from his own journey, his faith, and his work helping organizations create cultures of belonging, he invites us to see friendship not simply as a personal comfort, but as a powerful force for healing and transformation. Parfait, welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires.
Thank you, Melie, for having me. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, I am so excited to dive into this conversation. As I was looking at your book, I couldn't help but notice you open with a very powerful moment of self-recognition where you realized that your own hurt had shaped the way that you were seeing others. What did that moment teach you about how easily any of us might fall into othering?
Yes, a big part of what I explore in the book is the importance of self-reflection because our stories, especially the stories of hurt and trauma, our wounds, they become lenses through which we make sense of the world and interpret things that we notice and things that happen to us. And so I think for me, it's become something that I emphasize everywhere I go. I think that I'll try to help people realize that the things that we talked about with regards to cognitive biases oftentimes are, just fancy ways to talk about ways in which our past and our stories have become the lens through which we are, making sense of people and as a result, directing the way we respond. And so we are really at risk of reacting constantly based on the past if we don't take the time to pause and reflect on the ways our past and our hurt might be limiting the possibilities of new relationships and new opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you write about othering as, it strips away the humanity of both the otherer and the othered. What begins to happen inside of us when another person just becomes something like a label or somebody else to us?
Yeah, I know in my own story, as I, just for the sake of your listeners, what I explore in the book is my story as an immigrant because I used to travel by virtue of my parents used to work for an overseas organization in West Africa. Particular, I was born in Benin, and my dad used to work for this organization that took us from Benin to Niger, and then from Niger to Senegal, and then after I graduated from high school, I decided to wanted to study in the United States, and so that was the next trip across the Atlantic. So there was a lot of displacement and movement in my story, and so what would happen is as I would move from one place to another, I would often be reminded and that I was the outsider, that I didn't quite fit in or that I didn't belong. And oftentimes it was based on things that I had no control over, right? My accent or the color of my skin or, my experience with that cultural context. Or the language, and the list went on and on and on. And so, what that did for me when, being on the receiving end of being an outsider was this sense of powerlessness. Like, I can't control this. These are things that are outside of me. I had no choice over some of these things, yet they were a basis upon which I was being treated as a less than. Right. So on the receiving end of being othered, it just sucks. Simply put, it just sucks. You feel a sense of violation of, I think, your dignity. I think that that comes by virtue of being image bearers of God. But then when we do that, and again, I'm not saying that I've always just been on the receiving end. I do my fair share of mea culpa in the book of sharing stories where I have othered others as well, because it's a human tendency. But what happens is when we other the other person that fits into a different category or from a different tribe, is we are really numbing ourselves. We are shutting the door to the capacity of loving. We are shutting the door to the capacity of actually learning and growing in insight, in love, as I put it in the book, but also in some unexpected ways, we might actually be shutting the door to some potential healing for our own belonging wounds, and I've found it time and time again that when I was able to work past the othering and actually befriend, that I've found some nuggets of healing in my own storyline, in that person that I had no idea would hold those keys.
I love how you describe friendship as one of the few places that you could consistently call home. What did friendship give you that maybe culture or group identity could not?
Yeah. Oh wow. That's such that's such a great question. And there's two things that come up for me as you ask this question, Melly. The first thing is what made friendship so transformative in my own story was the fact that, right, as an immigrant moving from one place to another and oftentimes being reminded that I didn't belong, right, I that gave birth to this ache, right, this longing for where is home, where do I belong. And so that was a big catalyst for me moving towards my Christian faith initially, right? Because the narrative and the storyline of a God befriending humanity in an unconditional way was very appealing to me, given the story that I was experiencing, right? And so then friendships became almost this way in which God's unconditional love was being materialized, right? It became kind of the container space through which I was experiencing that unconditional love when unexpected friendships would happen. People who didn't necessarily look like me or believed like me or spoke like me would just accept me and be curious about me and my storyline. And so what that did for me was it made the esoterical, the theological real and concrete. And like I put in the book, the word friend and befriending comes from the same root word that give us the word to set free and to liberate. And for me, that even though at that time as a kid, I wasn't necessarily thinking of it from that lens, what I experienced spiritually, psychologically, was a sense of liberation and freedom to be myself, to flourish, to be creative, to be free, to be happy, to have fun. And in so doing, also, I was providing that to the other as well, right? So there was kind of a mutual exchange of liberation that was happening because my world was then expanding. I learned about other ways of being and got a deeper sense of confidence in who I was and what I was bringing as well. So in a very counterintuitive way, there was a liberation that was happening within those friendships.
I think for, a lot of folks listening, they might think of othering someone as, oh, that's something that hateful people do and angry people do that. But you show it can also grow from places of fear. It could be hurt, exhaustion, maybe a place of moral certainty. How can we start to recognize othering in ourselves before we end up in contempt?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We are all susceptible to othering. I'd like to talk about how, you know, our brain's purpose, right? Our brain's purpose in many ways is to protect us, right? Trying to make sure that you don't hurt yourself again. That one thing that happened that didn't feel good, that it never happens again, right? And so it's looking for patterns of recognition and giving some warning signs. Watch out, right? I remember something like that, right? And so one of the mitigation strategies I've found is really paying attention to our emotional responses and those warning signs that are telling us, watch out again. And I want to be careful saying this because I think the brain, the way God created us, is extremely brilliant and intelligent. So sometimes those warning signs are valid and they're like, just watch out. But they are just an attempt for pattern recognition that may or may not be true. And so there's a story I tell in the book about as an immigrant moving to the United States in the year 2000. I was initially growing this afro, and it was just a lot of joy for me because I was finally thousands of miles away from my parents. And growing up, cultural expectation in our house was to have a very clean cut haircut. You don't grow your hair above, you know, 2 to 3 inches high. And so my first experience of full freedom was let me grow an afro because I thought that would be cool. And so I was growing my little afro line, and I used to call my parents every weekend to give them updates about life here in the United States. And I would be very cautious to wear a hat or a beanie during those calls. And then one Saturday, at the end of the call, my mom, very, very strong woman, she told me, Parfait, great talking with you. But by the time we talk next week, make sure you take care of that hair, right? And here I was, right, in Portland, Oregon, which for those folks who are familiar with Portland, the way the city is broken down, it's kind of in quadrants. And I was going to Portland State University at that time, which is in the heart of downtown. And in terms of demographic, primarily white collar demographic. And so I started asking around, okay, where do I find a black barber in order to get, a haircut for people with a hair texture like mine. And I was told I needed to go to North or Northeast Portland, which was where the African American community was residing. And so I planned it based on my class schedule, and it was Thursday evening. I took the bus, started crossing town. And as I got into the black neighborhood, there was initially an emotional reaction of total admiration, right? I was excited about seeing the African American community for the first time at large in ways that I had grown to look at them from music videos that I was consuming thousands of miles away in West Africa because I loved hip hop music and just the charisma of the African American community. All that stuff was just on full display. I saw youth with like boomboxes on their shoulders, walking and all that stuff. So I was super, super elated. And then within about 10, 15 minutes, got up the bus, got to the location. And for the first time in my experience as an immigrant, I'm at the door of the barbershop that was fully filled with African American folks. And then there was a shift in my emotional response out of fear. And the only thing, and I tell in the book, the only thing that kept me going to getting this haircut was the fear of facing my mom in a few days, on the Skype call. And here's the punchline of the story. After the haircut and I was back on the bus, I had to really be honest with myself. Right? Face myself and face the music, I call it, and really question what was that response and not go the easy way of downplaying that emotion of fear that I'd experienced because there were so many ways I could have rationalized it, right? But I had to really hold the mirror and be honest with myself. And so all that to say, what we need to do as a strategy is really pay attention to the ways in which we've been socialized to other groups and other tribes. And when we catch ourselves starting to look at the other as less than, not as worthy, whatever the adjectives are, we need to pause and then really question that storyline. And then from there, take a proactive step of reaching out and moving towards. And so that was the end of my Afro journey because I decided I would go on a regular basis to reacquaint myself with a community that I was taught unintentionally to fear. Because at the same time, I was learning to admire their creativity and genius through the media and the movies, I was also being taught that they were dangerous, right? And I didn't realize that was happening. And so by realizing that, about really being honest with myself, I was able to say, okay, how can I move towards as a next step and transform the way my brain has been unintentionally wired to fear that community?
It's really interesting. Yeah, because the way our brains are wired, we'll get messages, maybe even subliminally. And if the message is fear this group, our brain will just, because it always defaults to the easiest path. That's one thing I always say is
Mm-hmm.
our brains are very efficient, but sometimes in that
Mm-hmm.
efficiency, they can cause real damage because if that's the path of least resistance is just, okay, fear this group, we're never going to spend the time to get to know these really rich communities and people. And I think this even extends in on a scale of even at church. I've noticed as a divorced woman, I had to move and start a whole new life, new community, new place. And finding a church that was not like, didn't like recoil from me when they would say,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, are you married?" They'd look, at my left hand, no ring, like, "Oh, like what's going on there?" I felt like I had to apologize for myself. I'm sorry, I'm actually divorced, and I'd say it like with, but it wasn't, I didn't choose to. I felt like I had to like make this big statement. And I could just see like some people didn't even bother to hide it on their face, they're like, ugh.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some, it was just sort of like a slow backing away, but feeling that, you know, what do we do in church situations where obviously, I mean, the ideal is that church is for everyone. So we should have these churches full of everybody. We shouldn't all look the same or talk the same or act the same.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it tends to kind of feel that's what happens. And if you don't fit the mold, you're kind of other.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your story and your experience. And I can only imagine, right? Yeah, I can see it happening. It happens with all the different categories that we've kind of pinned as the other. You don't fit the norm, right?
Yeah.
And there's no easy pathway but the way of befriending, and that's what I try to explore in the book, where it requires courage to introspect. And so when I talk about courage in the book, I talk about it through two lenses: introspective courage and then outward facing courage. And so the introspective piece is really to, again, what storyline have I come to believe? And usually the storylines are very reductionist and simplistic, right?
Hmm.
They don't really factor in the complexity, the nuances of people's lives and stories, and even the very God that we worship, right? When God has created this really complex, diverse world and people, yet we want to really boil things down into very simplistic black and white either or categories, and it doesn't always fit in that way. There's something I talk about in the book, how the labels and the simplistic storylines that we tend to want to use and apply to one another, a lot of our stories really escape those confines, right? And that's what makes Jesus so fascinating. He was really about, let me move towards you in your storyline and meet you there. And that's, I think that's the invitation for us. And so when I think about our places of worship, I think leaders and even from a grassroots level, we need to really explore how we cultivate the courage to hold a mirror about ways in which we've boxed people in ways that doesn't align with God's heart towards humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
That's one. And then the courage to move towards others with curiosity. So that requires cultivating a heart of inquiry. And so I use this framework in the book called Friend. The F is face yourself, which highlights the courage piece. The R is reaching out and reciprocating. It's really this movement towards. And then the I is for inquire first, right? What's your story? Let me hear you out. Let me understand what your journey has been. And usually something happens as a result of that. There's empathy that comes out and there's compassion that comes out because the stories are very powerful. People's stories are really complex. And so that's the R, reaching out. I is leading with inquiry. The E is extending grace to others as much as we would like grace extended to us. And then the N is normalizing differences. And that one is a little bit harder for us because I think subliminally we tend to expect others to be just like us, and to behave and live like us. But if we truly want to, answer the call of God to steward his love towards all of his creation, we have to face the reality that love without befriending is not love.
Yeah.
You know, in the same way scripture tells us that how can I say I love a God who is invisible, yet my brother and my sister who's, in needs, I don't move a finger. I think in the same way, how can I demonstrate that I'm full of love if I'm not moving towards those who are different from me, right? And then the D is the do it again and again and again and again. And to go back to your area of expertise and passion, repetition makes permanent. It makes it a little bit easier the next time around, right? Because then we're building those synapses that makes it a little bit more natural the next time around to move towards others. So anyway, I went there at length, but I don't know if that answered the question you had.
Yeah, that was really great. And I love the framework. When somebody is, in this place where they are feeling other, it could be a work situation, school, church, wherever the place may be, and they are in a place where they can tell that's what's happening to them, what steps can they take Should they just leave and find a different place? What if they can't? Maybe they have an employer that is just not, they can just sense that. How do they go forward and handle that? And not just accept it and stay in that place, but actually make a difference?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I get oftentimes a lot of questions around this, and even I would I would say some pushback at times because some folks hear this idea of befriending as me asking people to put themselves into places of harm. And one thing that I often like to say is that what I'm advocating for or inviting us towards is not reckless exposure to harm, not at all. I think it's very important as one you find yourself in a situation where you feel like, man, I feel like I'm not fitting in here. I'm being othered. I think one is doing the inventory and reflecting on how much of this is either me carrying in or bringing into the space my own trauma and my own past. Because one of the things, I tell the story, and I'm not going to go into the details here because it will be too long, but a story of a time at a conference where someone unexpectedly befriended me. But what led to that befriending was me operating out of just a used pattern, something I got used to, which was to keep myself on the outside because that was kind of my storyline. So it became some sort of a self fulfilling prophecy. Right.
Mm.
And so, really important to, again, going back to that facing myself and really analyzing why am I feeling this way? Is that just me reenacting the same storyline? And if so, really questioning that and stepping into my own agency and what do I want to do differently. So there's always an element of agency that we have to either choose to stay there or say, you know what, I'm not gonna let this go the way it's going. I'm gonna speak my truth, my story. Usually speaking the truth without an attempt to try to harm or react is powerful enough. Just stating the facts. I love what you were sharing earlier, Melie, about just exposing people to a different storyline. That no,
Mhm.
I'm divorced, and this is the fact, right?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes a lot of folks are just like all of us, we are confined by what we've known and experienced up till now,
Right.
right? And so there's a gift in sharing the truth as is and exposing people to something they may not have had to contend with before. So I think there's an element of response that way. And then if really upon trying some of these things, speaking the truth and engaging folks, and you still feel like it's not a spot for you where you cannot thrive and it's causing a lot of pain, sometimes we need space in order to be able to heal, right?
Right.
But what I'm inviting us to is to not just default to that movement away, because that's kind of our tendency is to move away without first leaning into courage, curiosity, and compassion, because there's so much transformation that can happen when we can hang long enough and
Mhm.
speak honestly with courage, and also be curious even about those people who at first we feel like they're othering us. The more we start understanding maybe what's shaped that, there can be some compassion that can come out of that and then transform the whole dynamic.
Yeah, I love that. And it's such a good reminder when we think about, like you were talking about the courage and curiosity and compassion. And I would think about that in terms of like for me to take those on to not others. But then if I'm feeling othered, I need to also have those three things as well. I think in various situations, it's been both. There's been times where people have been maybe not very kind about the fact that I'm divorced. And sometimes it is just my own reading in. Like I'm used to that. And I'm
Hmm.
preconditioned to just feel like I have to like fight my
Hmm.
way to be in the room. But maybe I don't. And I could just have a little courage and curiosity for the people that I'm meeting to not assume that they are going to other me for
Yeah.
being different. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you nailed it there. I there's some situational roles of belonging that I unpack in the book, and it's this idea that in any setting, whether we realize it or not, oftentimes there will be someone who might be experiencing that setting as an outsider, and it might be perceived or actually real, right?
Mhm.
There's those in that setting who are well adjusted to the way things have been, to the status quo, even if it's an uneven status quo. They're like, hey, I can roll with this. It's working for me. Who cares about the others, right? And then you have the gatekeeper, who is the person or the team of people who are setting up the rules, whether formally or informally in that setting. And they might be unintentionally creating outsider experiences, and the invitation is how can we be the friend in that setting? And being a friend is just the desire and intentionality to notice who might be on the outside or experiencing that setting as an outsider, and then leaning to empathy, through curiosity, to really empathize with what that experience might be in order to then respond in a compassionate way. Because oftentimes when we've been hurt and we've been on the outside, that can become a wall that just closes us off, and automatically we interpret every behavior as through that lens. But the invitation is to still stay proximate to what has hurt us so that we never forget, but to not let ourselves be defined by it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hard work of unpacking, what might be going on here, and then courage, curiosity, and compassion can help us have more clarity around where the other people are coming from so that we can make an informed decision in terms of next steps.
Amazing. Now, I know I saw that you had done, I watched a video where you went into a school and you were teaching this and to high schoolers and using music, incorporating music into it, which I absolutely love. And I want to dive into that a little bit in just a minute. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on taking this kind of message into schools and teaching this earlier on. I think a lot of people start to learn this as they get older, if they learn it, it's when they're older and they've already been more ingrained in their
hmm
thought patterns. Like, how do you see this when you go into the schools? Do you find that they're more open than, say, corporate, or how does that work?
Yeah. It really depends. I have a huge heart for the next generation. Just like you said here, I really believe that skills around conflict prevention, social and emotional learning should be part of the core curriculum very
Yeah.
early on. We are not doing ourselves a service as a society by not incorporating those into the core curriculum. But what I find when I go into schools to try to have these conversations around othering and bullying and the importance of kind of moving towards others who are different from us is that it depends on the audience, right? I think kids are still very, what word am I looking for here, influenceable at that age, right?
Hmm.
And so there's kind of a willingness to lean in, and the music really helps, and we're going to impact the music in a little bit. They're impressionable. Here we go, that's the word I was looking for. And so that provides some inroads, I believe. I But they also give me a lens into our broader society, because this activity that I do around, there's a song called Let's Face It, where I unpack my own story of how I came to realize in the United States after about 2 years of being here. And I was complaining about how Americans were putting me into a box of their choosing, and I didn't like it. But then how, in turn, unintentionally, I was just being a hypocrite because I was also putting Americans into a box. And it took a friend of mine who was very courageous, again, that whole theme around courage in relationships, who really called me in and said, "Hey, Parfait, again, I'm sure things are rough, and things are rough for you over there, but I've been listening to you for the last year and a half, and you are putting the Americans into boxes too." And so you are doing the very same thing that you are, complaining about being a victim of. And that was kind of a light bulb moment. And I wrote a song called Let's Face It, which was kind of my version of A Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson, in which I'm just kind of naming some of my patterns and ways in which I'm boxing people in. And I have these mental responses when there's differences or disagreements or frustration and so on and on and on. And then I'm talking about in the song, I'm going through a journey by which I'm saying, okay, I'm going to let it go going forward. These patterns, I'm going to put them away and try something new. And I call it, the chorus goes like, one new song, one new story. I'm changing my ways, right? And so I've sang this song and done the workshop with some middle schoolers. And then one of the activity that I do with them is I have kind of a bucket, and I have them write on a post-it a bunch of labels or stigmas or stereotypes that they tend to use towards others, or they've used that others. And then as I sing the song, I sing the song, they take it in, and then I walk around the room and I give them the opportunity to let go of those stereotypes, in a symbolic way, in an embodied way. Would you choose to let go of that post-it in this bucket? And it's fascinating to see those who, without hesitation, will drop it, those who are looking at it, they're like, I don't know if I want to drop it. That kind of feels good. It's kind of a security blanket. I'm gonna hold it. And there are those who literally choose to keep it, right? And I explored this in the book, how, as adults, it's a similar composition in a tiered approach. Some of us, when we come to realize, holy mackerel, I've been doing this thing. I don't want to do it, right? I want to let it go. And some of us say, well, but it feels good though. I want to stay there. And some of us say, no, I'm not ready yet. And there's no pressure in that activity, but I think the awareness is very important to recognize where we are, because whether we're young or old, I think the same things are they apply. It's the willingness to recognize our hurt, our struggles, and where's God calling us towards, and would we follow Him?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Now let's dive a little bit into your songwriting. I'm really fascinated as someone who I used to write songs and I do some worship leading, so I'm always excited to meet fellow musicians. Tell us a little bit about what led you to that. Have you always been a musician? When did you write your first song?
Yeah, yeah. Always great to be in the presence of other fellow artists as well. Yeah, music was very therapeutic for me as early as I can remember. In elementary grade, I would just kind of hum melodies. My mom used to be very active in a choir at church. And so I just always enjoyed a good melody. And then when I started having more, life experiences of feeling othered, I began writing my own songs. And at first it was hip hop. It was a lot of rap music, believe it or not, because I grew up in the I was born in the 80s, and so when I was coming of age, hip hop was huge worldwide. And so the manner in which in rap music you can say so much in such little amount of time and you're just
Hmm.
kind of pouring your heart out, that was really appealing to me. And then I would just put like a nice melody hook for the chorus and so forth. And so music has always been that way there for me to process my emotions, especially the ones of feeling like the outsider, or my longing for a better world where we are not jerks to each other, right? And so I would write that way. And then when I started sharing those songs, regardless of the continent where I was, there was always a resonance with people. People would just resonate with some of those themes, which started to speak to me about a larger shared experience around our longing for belonging, our longing for unconditional love, our longing to be seen and valued, right? And so that's how it started becoming part of my methodology, because I was just hearing people resonating with songs that were so deeply personal and tied to my own storyline, but yet people could see themselves and hear themselves in it. And seeing people react and respond in ways that just words alone don't often,
Yeah.
just give me a hint into the power of music. And so it became an intricate part of how I engage and communicate. And so when I get a chance to write this book, I had to figure out with the publisher, how do I incorporate some of the songs that speak to some of these ideas. And they were really, really collaborative in looking into the QR code next to the lyrics that are referenced, so that that could be a multimedia experience for the reader. So I'm super excited about that.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, that's amazing. And I love how you said, music can reach people in ways that maybe words can't always do on their own. So I love that idea of incorporating the songs. And yeah, for listeners, we will have in the show notes links so that you can get the book. Please check it out. We'll also have a link to Parfait's website. Please do listen to his music. Very exciting. So thank you. I'd love to know, when it comes to friendship and belonging, if there was one thing that readers of your book would reconsider after reading your book, what is that thing that you would ask?
Yeah, that's a great question. One theme that I have tried to put throughout the book is this idea of unexpected movement towards the other. And what I mean by that is, so first, I hope that as people read the book, they walk away feeling like, you know what, it's possible. It's possible, and that we all have a part we can play in really healing our divisions in our country. We didn't even get into the statistics that really led me to writing this book, because a lot of it is very alarming, right? One in three adults is reporting experiencing loneliness in our country. Every other youth is reporting experiencing loneliness, and there's direct correlation between loneliness and adverse health outcomes, all the way to even a shorter life expectancy. And so we got to disrupt the status quo, because insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. And so, what my premise in the book is, you know, what about movement towards the other in unexpected ways? Because I know what to expect when the left leaning liberal hears me say something that is countercultural, and vice versa, or the person on the right hears me say something that is counter the narrative in the tribal, in that echo chamber. Or I know what to expect when you fill in the blank, right? We
Hmm.
have our talking points ready, our trigger points ready. And so let's disrupt that narrative by unexpected acts of compassion and curiosity, and see what happens, because the research does tell us that when we actually move towards others in unexpected ways that reveal a potential point of connection, or demonstrate a degree of support and care, or provides an opportunity for someone to feel heard, the dynamics change, and the soil is a little bit more ripe, more written for even change and transformation to happen. And so that's my invitation, that people will feel inspired to say, you know what, let me try something different. Rather than trying to be right at all cost, let me try to move towards understanding and see what might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can share, what is something that gives you hope that a less divided and more compassionate way of living is still possible, given all that, we do know is going on in our culture
Yeah.
today and what's happening in the world?
Yeah, it's stories. There's stories that are happening, and that's what I try to do in the book, by sharing stories that are happening, because we can feel very overwhelmed and cynical based on the big news and that we're hearing from, news outlets and what have you. But in local communities, there are people doing amazing things, moving towards others, and there's some transformation that's happening. And so that gives me hope every time I hear about it. I'm gonna put a shameless plug here for this organization that my wife started. It's called Relume, Relume. They are making candles, artisan candles, soy candles, really, really quality candles, and they're employing refugees who have been having a hard time finding a job upon moving to the United States. That's an example of befriending. And that came from movement towards what they didn't know. And as they started hearing their stories and walking alongside them, came to realize, holy cow, employers are hesitant to give them a shot,
Mm,
because of language barriers, or because of, you know, the trade, the barrier to learning the skill that applies to that job. And so it was just interviews upon interviews, and it was just a long journey. And so my wife and a good friend of ours, moved by, again, compassion, said, you know what? Wait a second, making candles does not require English proficiency or an advanced degree. And they started a business where right now they're employing two amazing ladies, one from Syria and one from the Congo, who are, a little bit older, and will be hard for them to find a traditional job. And they are making beautiful candles while, being given opportunity to practice English during
wow.
some of the shifts, and to give them a job experience so that they can build on that eventually to go somewhere else if they so choose. So there are stories like that are happening that give me hope, and kind of illustrate that it's possible for all of us to move towards those who are different in very powerful ways.
I love that story. And we will put the link in the show notes to Relume as well. That sounds like a really beautiful organization.
Thank you.
So, as we wrap up today, I'd love to know, what is something that is bringing you joy these days?
Yeah, I would honestly say, especially at this juncture, so my book came out June 23rd, which is just surreal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been just sort of surreal to be walking this journey right now. And so what's been bringing me a lot of joy is just conversations like this one. I've gotten to meet such incredible people with stories that I were not on my radar, doing incredible things and holding space of healing and transformation across the country, and getting to talk with them and hearing their stories and answering questions about this work. It's just been giving me a lot of joy. So I'm deeply grateful for your ministry and the work that you do, and for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. This was such a great conversation. I know that listeners are going to really resonate with what you've had to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
And listeners, I just want to remind you Parfait's book, The Way of Befriending, Transforming Relationships and Organizations for Belonging, is available now from InterVarsity Press and wherever books are sold. We will have links to the book and Parfait's work and music in the show notes. And to everyone listening today, perhaps the invitation this week is simply to notice where fear, hurt, or certainty has created distance and to consider what one small movement of courage, curiosity, or compassion might make possible. Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.